Have you ever imagined a robbery that ends not with the arrest of criminals, but with a twist of nature itself? It looks like something out of an action movie or a horror script, doesn't it? But in fact, this story really happened on an isolated ranch in the Arizona countryside, and the denouement was so surprising that even the police officers who arrived at the scene were speechless. A group of armed criminals broke into the ranch during the early hours of the morning with clear intentions of stealing money and valuables. Everything seemed to be under control until the moment when, in the haste of escape, one of them kicked an abandoned barrel without realizing what was inside. And that's when everything changed. Can you imagine what a simple movement can bring about in a situation of chaos? That was exactly the lesson of that day. The barrel, which seemed harmless, was actually home to a swarm of marimbondos. As soon as the barrel was kicked, a cloud of insects came out with stunning violence, attacking everything around. The assailants, who were loaded with weapons and money, began to live a sudden scene of terror, completely unpredictable. Fear took over, and the escape turned into a veritable spectacle of disorientation and confusion. Who could have imagined that an attack by marimbondos could end an attempted robbery in such a dramatic way? Stay with me until the end, because what you will discover now can really surprise you. While the criminals tried to escape, abandoning weapons and some of the stolen money, neighbors reported that the scene looked like something out of an action movie mixed with a nightmare. Screams, agitation, angry insects, and a sense of total chaos. The arrival of the police was almost a natural consequence of this moment of despair. When the police arrived at the scene, they found the assailants completely disoriented, frightened, and injured by the marimbondos' attacks. And it is exactly this story that shows us how much nature often acts as a silent guardian, capable of reversing situations that seem irreversible. Have you ever been in a situation where nature surprised you? Stay with me, because this story is far from over, and what comes next will leave you even more intrigued. If you found this story of a robbery that ends with an attack by marimbondos something unbelievable, know that this type of surprise from nature usually happens when we least expect it. This experience reminds us that no matter how hard we try to control everything around us, life always finds a way to show us that there are forces that go beyond our understanding, and sometimes these forces manifest themselves silently, like a hidden hive or a swarm of insects that reacts unexpectedly. Reflecting on these moments helps us appreciate the power of nature and the importance of staying calm in the face of chaotic situations. If this story touched you in any way, or made you think about personal experiences, leave here in the comments what caught your attention the most, or some situation you experienced that surprised you. Sharing our experiences is a way to create connection and learn from the stories of those who accompany us. Also, take the opportunity to enjoy the video so we can continue bringing content that involves the unexpected of life and lessons it gives us. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow, helping more people reflect on the impact of nature in decisive moments. And if you want to follow each news story, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, because news always comes out, and your presence makes all the difference so that this community continues to grow and strengthen. It was dawn in an isolated region of Arizona, where absolute silence reigned, broken only by the distant sound of the dry wind blowing across the desert. The sky was dark, punctuated by stars that seemed to observe everything from above, as silent witnesses of a night that promised to be quiet, although charged with an invisible tension. In this setting of isolation, the ranch stood like a small fortress, surrounded by open fields and with few scattered trees, which seemed not to care about the stillness of the dawn. For those who did not know the place, it seemed an area forgotten by time, a space where nature still maintained its strong and silent presence. For the criminals planning the robbery, this environment was perfect. Without close neighbors, without residents nearby, they had the illusion that they could act unnoticed, taking advantage of silence and the absence of witnesses. The plan seemed very elaborate, with the idea of breaking into the ranch, stealing whatever he could find of value and disappearing into the night. Every step, every movement was done carefully, hoping to avoid any warning signs. The adrenaline was beginning to rise, but they believed that with the rapidity of the act, they would soon be able to get rid of the crime scene before anyone noticed. However, what they could not foresee was that the surrounding environment itself had its secrets, a quiet routine that few noticed, but which could turn into an unexpected force. This region, as desolate as it may seem, harbors a diversity of life that often goes unnoticed. Insects, small animals and plants adapted to the extreme conditions of the desert all play a role in the web of life that pulsates hidden there. And it was precisely one of these presences that would completely transform the scenario, changing the course of history in a way that no one could have imagined. While the criminals moved, careful not to make noise, the night remained silent, as if it were a mute witness to everything that happened. His steps were careful, almost stealthy, while the sound of the wind seemed to accompany his every move, creating an atmosphere of suspense that only those who know the desert understand. At this moment, the environment seemed to be at rest, but in fact a silent threat was approaching, ready to respond in a dramatic and unexpected way. What seemed like an ordinary night, with the typical calm of a place far from the city, would turn into an episode marked by a natural reaction that no one could predict. A lesson in how nature often acts silently, but with immense force. Meanwhile, the criminals, with weapons in hand and the hope of conquering something easy, did not think twice when invading that space. The story, which seemed simple at first, began to unfold in a way that would change everything. The presence of the desert, the vulnerability of the setting and the routine of that environment created a perfect stage for an episode that would later be remembered as an example of how the impact of nature can reverse the most planned action, bringing a revelation that no one can predict until it happens. And just that night, everything began to prepare for a transformation that would forever mark the history of that ranch and everyone who would accompany its narrative. Armed and confident, the men advanced down the dirt road that led to the ranch with steady steps and determined looks. The night seemed to amplify every sound, making the silence even heavier as they approached their goal with almost military precision. Every move was calculated, every step planned to avoid any noise that might alert whoever was inside. Their posture conveyed a coldness that only those who have been through extreme situations can show, a calm that hid the intensity of the intention to steal and leave without a trace. They knew that time was of the essence, that any hesitation could put everything at risk. So the action was fast, almost mechanical, as if it were a routine they had known for a long time. As they entered the ranch, the atmosphere completely changed. The space, which seemed quiet at that time, became the scene of an aggressive action. The criminals wasted no time in demonstrating how determined they were. With precise movements, they searched the rooms looking for money, jewelry, and valuables. The dim light of lanterns illuminated the faces of the invaders, revealing expressions of concentration and at the same time of impassivity. None of them showed fear or hesitation. For them, it was a mission, a decision made with coolness and determination, without room for doubts or emotions. The scene was marked by a combination of quickness, restrained violence, and a sense of constant threat. The officials present, frightened and totally unprepared for a situation of that level, tried to react, but the strength of the invaders was overwhelming. With harsh words and short commands, they tried to intimidate whoever was on the spot, making it clear that any resistance would be useless. This posture, combined with the armed presence, reinforced the level of danger that this group represented. The feeling of insecurity took over the environment, while fear spread like a shadow that seemed to seep into every corner of the ranch. The speed of the invasion was not only a matter of efficiency, but also a strategy to avoid any kind of reaction from residents or employees. Every second was made the most of as the tension increased. The criminals seemed to be in a fast-paced game, as if they were in a race against time, aware that any carelessness could turn that moment into something even more dangerous. And even with all the coolness and determination, something unexpected was beginning to brew in the shadow of that silent night, a force of nature that would quietly make all the difference. The impact of this action, although it seemed like a simple robbery, was beginning to turn into something much bigger than they could have imagined. The combination of the hostile environment, the decision to act with violence, and the confidence that nothing would stop them seemed to guarantee the success of the invasion, but the outcome would inevitably change the entire narrative. The story of that moment, loaded with hasty decisions, fear, and brute force, began to unfold to reveal a hidden truth that at the time, no one had any way to predict. What happened soon after, with the arrival of the unexpected, would show that many times the impact of nature and the environment itself can rewrite the rules of the game, leaving marks that remain in the memory of those who witness or live a situation like this. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject and explore how this silent force, which is often underestimated, manages to transform scenarios considered impossible to reverse. The history of the ranch in Arizona, marked by an invasion that seemed predestined for success, begins to show that no matter how much we plan, there are natural forces that act invisibly, but absolutely decisively. This transformation, which seemed to be solely the result of human actions, reveals a truth that is hidden in the routine, in everyday life, and behind the scenes of life. And it is precisely this revelation that invites us to reflect on our own decisions, our journeys, and the impact of factors that we often ignore, but that can change everything in an instant. Having managed to grab a considerable amount of money and some valuables, the robbers began to move quickly, as if a cloud of panic was guiding their every step. The rush was so great that every move seemed charged with an almost desperate urgency. The feeling that they were narrowly escaping led them not to think twice, not to analyze what they could be leaving behind or the risks they could be facing when trying to escape from that place. The idea that they could be caught at any moment drove them to speed up even more, even if this was a decision that could put everything at risk. In their eagerness to escape, they began to ignore important details, such as the uneven terrain, the obstacles around, or even the signs that something might be wrong there. Confusion took over their minds, and the strategy they had so carefully worked out was replaced by an unbridled race against time. In this moment of disarray, attention turned exclusively to the exit, to the hope of disappearing into the vastness of the desert before anyone noticed the invasion. The idea that they were almost free made them believe that nothing could go wrong, that everything was under control. But this blind trust was precisely what opened the door to a sequence of errors that would change the course of the night. As they tried to pass through an exit door, one of them, in his haste, kicked a barrel that had been there for some time, apparently abandoned. It was a quick move made without thinking, driven by fear of being caught or losing everything they had managed to steal. However, what they didn't know was that that barrel held something far more dangerous than any gun or money. Inside, a swarm of marimbondos had settled for months, protecting their space with a quiet determination. As soon as the barrel was kicked, a cloud of angry insects came out from inside it, with a violence that seemed to envelop the entire scene in an almost surreal way. The attack was instantaneous and devastating. The marimbondos, who until then had remained hidden, emerged with an impressive force, attacking each of the assailants who were there in an attempt to escape. Screams of pain and surprise echoed through the night as the invaders tried to get rid of these aggressive creatures. The confusion turned into absolute panic, and the scene turned into complete chaos. The criminals, who until then had considered themselves the owners of that moment, became victims of a natural force that appeared by surprise and without warning. In that instant, all that escape strategy fell apart, and they found themselves totally disoriented, with their weapons forgotten, the stolen objects falling to the ground, and their minds dominated by the fear of being attacked again. That mistake, made in the rush to escape, turned out to be his biggest trap. The impact of the swarm of marimbondos was so intense that it held them in place, preventing them from moving forward or even thinking clearly. The feeling that they were almost free was replaced by a desperate struggle for survival. At that moment, their vulnerability was evident, and the vulnerability of those who try to act without thinking about the force of nature itself. What seemed like a successful escape turned into a real lesson that haste combined with carelessness can open doors to the unexpected, to the revelation of a hidden truth that has always been there, hidden under the surface. And so, while the screams still echoed in the night, the robbers began to realize that the real strength of that moment did not come only from the weapons or the stolen money, but from the very environment that they completely underestimated. Every step taken in the wrong direction, every hurried movement, had created an opportunity for something invisible, silent, and deadly to arise and change everything. The eyes of the authorities who were on their way did not yet know exactly what awaited them, but what would happen from then on would show that often the greatest transformation happens behind the scenes, in those details that seem insignificant, but that have the power to rewrite a story in a matter of seconds. At that moment, the impact of the night became a lesson that one's journey, however planned, can be interrupted by revelations that come from where one least expects them. Revelations that make all the difference in the journey yet to come. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject because it is precisely in this moment of distraction, impulse, and hasty decision that the greatest revelations often arise, those that completely change the direction of a story. In this case, the mistake was simple, seemingly unimportant, but which eventually turned into the key piece of a turnaround that no one could predict. One of the criminals, in a hurry to escape, kicked hard an old barrel abandoned in the yard of the ranch. The idea, perhaps, was just to clear the way, facilitate the exit, or even get rid of something that could hinder the escape. But what seemed an ordinary and even commonplace attitude had, in fact, a fatal consequence. A consequence that no one could imagine at the time, because, in fact, what seemed to be just scrap metal carried a hidden truth that was going to reveal itself in a dramatic way. The barrel in its trash appearance hid under its aged structure a huge nest of marimbondos. These insects, which most of the time remain in the shade, protecting their space with a quiet determination, were there, asleep and silent, until the disturbance in the structure of the barrel was enough to awaken them. And that's exactly what happened. As soon as the barrel was kicked hard, a chain reaction began. The marimbondos, who had been at rest until then, came out with impressive violence, forming a cloud of angry insects that quickly spread through the environment. The force of the impact was enough to release a huge amount of marimbondos, which attacked everything around, turning the chaos into a real explosion of attacks and screams of pain. In that instant, everything changed in an abrupt and dramatic way. What once seemed like a quick and planned escape has become a desperate fight for survival. The assailants, who until then considered themselves the owners of the moment, became victims of a natural force that appeared out of nowhere silently, but that carried a lethal intensity. The reaction of the marimbondos was instantaneous and devastating. They attacked in a coordinated way, furious and merciless, hitting the invaders with a ferocity that seemed driven by an ancient revenge, a force that only nature itself can awaken. Screams of pain echoed through the night, mixing with the sound of insects buzzing around, creating an almost surreal scene where fear, pain, and surprise mixed into a single emotion. That mistake, made in the rush to escape, turned out to be his biggest trap. The criminals, now completely disoriented, tried to get away from the cloud of marimbondos that surrounded them, but the amount of insects was so much that it was almost impossible to escape. Each impulsive movement seemed to further fuel the attack, as if nature itself was responding to aggression, defending its space with a silent but immense force. The invaders tried to protect themselves, covering their faces, jumping, screaming, but there was no escape. The marimbondos, furious and determined, continued to attack, leaving visible marks on the skin of each of them as a cruel reminder that nature often acts silently, but with a force that cannot be underestimated. The scene turned into a real, natural horror show. The screams of pain, the noise of insects, and the general confusion created an atmosphere of absolute chaos, where logic disappeared and the instinct of survival took over everyone. The criminals, who had planned everything precisely, now found themselves completely vulnerable in the face of a force they had no way of foreseeing. And as they tried to get rid of the insects and escape from there, the hidden truth was revealed. The force of nature itself, the one that often goes unnoticed, can change the course of a story in a matter of seconds. The impact of that moment was not only physical, but also psychological. The silent force that came out of that barrel revealed that the vulnerability of the human being often lies in his own arrogance, in his lack of attention to detail, in his inability to realize that, no matter how hard we try to control everything, there are forces that completely escape our reach. That night in Arizona became a clear example of how an impulsive decision, a seemingly insignificant mistake, can trigger a chain of events that change everything. The assailants, who believed they were in control of a situation, were taken by surprise by a natural force that presented itself in a brutal and definitive way. And at the same time, that story left a lesson that echoes to this day. Transformation is often in the details, behind the scenes of what we think is insignificant or irrelevant. That night in Arizona became a clear example of how an impulsive decision, a seemingly insignificant mistake, can trigger a chain of events that change everything. The assailants, who believed they were in control of a situation, were taken by surprise by a natural force that presented itself in a brutal and definitive way. And at the same time, that story left a lesson that echoes to this day. Transformation is often in the details behind the scenes of what we think is insignificant or irrelevant. The truth hidden there, in that abandoned barrel, has shown us that the impact of an action can be devastating when we least expect it, and that nature herself, in her silent essence, is an implacable guardian of her truths. And, while the screams still echoed in the night, the invaders tried to understand what had happened, but the lesson was already given. The fatal mistake, the one that seemed minimal at the time, turned out to be a real game-changer, a transformation that no one could have, and, while the screams still echoed in the night, the invaders tried to understand what had happened, but the lesson was already given. The fatal mistake, the one that seemed minimal at the time, turned out to be a real game-changer, a transformation that no one could have predicted. Those who were there, in an attempt to commit a crime, ended up becoming victims of a force that escapes immediate understanding, a force that acts behind the scenes in the details, in what we often fail to perceive. And it is this force that remains invisible, silent, but which has the power to rewrite stories, changing destinies in a definitive way. This revelation, which is born precisely in the vulnerability of a moment of distraction, shows that in the journey of each one, the greatest transformation can come exactly from where it is least expected, in what seems to be only a surplus, a scrap, a detail that goes unnoticed. In a matter of seconds, the silence of the night was completely in a matter of seconds. The silence of the night was completely interrupted by a sound that seemed to invade every corner of the room, a mixture of deafening hums that spread like a wave of chaos. It was the moment when the swarm of marimbondos, awakened by the impact of the barrel, decided to act with a fury that no one could predict. The cloud of angry insects came out in a real onslaught of attack, filling the air with a constant buzzing sound, almost like a symphony of destruction. Each insect seemed moved by a force of silent vengeance, an instinctive response to the disturbance of its refuge. The criminals, who until then had been confident in their escape strategy, soon realized that they were facing an invisible but devastating enemy. When the marimbondos started hitting their skin, their reactions became instantaneous and desperate. Screams of pain and surprise echoed among the chaos as they tried to protect themselves as they could, raising their hands, covering their faces, jumping in a disorderly manner. The scene. The criminals, who until then had been confident in their escape strategy, soon realized that they were facing an invisible but devastating enemy. When the marimbondos started hitting their skin, their reactions became instantaneous and desperate. Screams of pain and surprise echoed among the chaos as they tried to protect themselves as they could, raising their hands, covering their faces, jumping in a disorderly manner. The scene seemed a mixture of terror and confusion, a real battle between the instinct of survival and the silent force of nature. At that moment, the impact was not only physical, but psychological. The men, who until then considered themselves capable of facing any obstacle, saw their security transformed into a glaring vulnerability. The speed of the attack, the number of marimbondos, and the ferocity with which they launched themselves against the invaders made the escape become a desperate attempt to escape from a threat that seemed to have no end. The screams of pain mixed with the sound of continuous buzzing, creating a kind of nightmarish atmosphere that seemed to have no end. Every wrong move, every attempt to push the insects away, only further fueled the aggressiveness of the swarm, which had no intention of stopping until they felt confident that the threat had been neutralized. It was a real moment of absolute chaos, in which fear, pain, and confusion mixed so intensely that it seemed that the world had been turned upside down. The criminals carrying weapons and money was a real moment of absolute chaos, in which fear, pain, and confusion mixed so intensely that it seemed that the world had been turned upside down. The criminals carrying weapons and money became victims of a force they could not control, a force that at its core was pure and silent. The scene clearly showed how human vulnerability can arise even in those moments when we think we are in control. The impact of the marimbondos' attack was so profound that, for an instant, everything was paralyzed, as if the world had slowed down because of that natural phenomenon that revealed itself as a true weapon of defense. The mood of panic intensified as the insects continued to mercilessly attack, leaving visible marks on the skin of the invaders. The screams of pain and the frenzied agitation created a scene that looked like something out of a horror movie. The mood of panic intensified as the insects continued to mercilessly attack, leaving visible marks on the skin of the invaders. The screams of pain and the frenzied agitation created a scene that looked like something out of a horror movie, but which, in fact, was the harsh reality of that instant. The men tried to get rid of these aggressive creatures, jumping from side to side, looking for some shelter, while the swarm gave no signs that it would retreat. Every second felt like an eternity, a battle between man and the silent force of nature, a battle that most people are not prepared to face. In the midst of that confusion, it became clear that the real strength of that moment did not come from weapons or stolen money, but from the very unpredictability of life, from nature that often acts silently but with overwhelming intensity. The impact of that in the midst of that confusion, it became clear that the real strength of that moment did not come from weapons or stolen money, but from the very unpredictability of life, from nature that often acts silently but with overwhelming intensity. The impact of that attack was a lesson that nothing is fully under control, that even the most elaborate plans can be destroyed by an invisible force ready to react. The screams, the races, and the unbridled movement revealed the vulnerability of those who underestimate the power of the environment around them, a vulnerability that, if not recognized in time, can turn an attempted crime into a real tragedy. And there, that night, chaos took over everything, leaving a permanent mark on the memory of those who lived and witnessed that moment of pure. And there, that night, chaos took over everything, leaving a permanent mark on the memory of those who lived and witnessed that moment of pure natural reaction. The marimbondos, silent guardians of that space, have shown that no matter how much humans try to control their history, there are forces that remain hidden behind the scenes, ready to emerge relentlessly when you least expect it. The force of the impact, the intensity of the fear, the rapidity of the scene, all reinforce the idea that often the greatest transfer, the force of the impact, the intensity of the fear, the rapidity of the scene, all reinforce the idea that often the greatest transformation occurs in those situations of greatest vulnerability, when the universe reminds us that there are limits that we cannot cross without paying a price. And in the end, what remains is the certainty that nature, in its purest and most silent essence, is an implacable guardian of its truths, capable of transforming any story, no matter how planned, into a lesson that remains forever. That scene of chaos and pain did not go unnoticed by the residents who lived in the vicinity of the ranch. Even though most of them were some distance away, the noise of that marimbondo attack was impossible to ignore. The screams of pain, the screams of despair, and the deafening sound of insects spread throughout the region, invading the silence of the night with an intensity that seemed to come out of an action movie. Some neighbors, awakened by the commotion, reported that what they saw was something that seemed surreal, a scene of terror fueled by a natural force beyond human control. The description of those who were around reinforces the idea that the scene seemed like a kind of nightmare, a mixture of horror and action, where the vulnerability of the human being was shown in a clear and brutal way. They said the screams echoed loudly, almost as if they were cries for help in a battle for survival. Many reported that when they looked at her, they said the screams echoed loudly, almost as if they were cries for help in a battle for survival. Many reported that when they looked at the ranch, they saw a real mess of bodies moving in a disorderly manner. Trying to escape from witnesses also said that in the confusion, some thieves began to run in circles, unable to escape from that natural fury that seemed to have been aroused by a simple act of carelessness. The emotional impact was so strong that even from a distance it was possible to feel the anguish that hung in the air. They reported that the sound of the screams, mixed with the incessant buzzing, seemed to create a kind of symphony of destruction, something that would be marked in the memory of those who heard it. For these residents, that night became a real proof that nature, when provoked or disturbed, reacts in a way that often escapes human understanding. As a silent guardian, she has shown that her forces can be devastating, even when they seem harmless or hidden. Some said that when they looked at the scene, it seemed that the environment itself had turned into a battle scene, where the vulnerability of the man was shown in its rawest form. The images that remained in the head of those who saw it all were of desperate people trying to flee, seeing their efforts become useless in the face of a force as silent as it was deadly. The feeling that it could all end there in that instant was almost palpable, and the impression they left was that in the routine of everyday life, we often ignore the small signs that the environment around us holds dangerous secrets, which can be activated by a seemingly insignificant action. The impact of that night was not limited to the moment of the attack. It reverberated in the collective memory, reinforcing the understanding that human vulnerability often lies in their own ignorance or carelessness. The force of nature, silent and constant, acts behind the scenes, preparing to respond in ways we can't always foresee. And what was marked in the popular narrative was precisely this essence: the idea that no matter how harmless it may seem, nature has its own rhythm and its own limits, capable of transforming a crime scene into a real lesson in respect for the environment. The story of that attack spread in the community, becoming a clear example that the hidden truth often lies in the simplest details, in the moments of distraction, in the decision not to pay attention to what is happening around us. And when reflecting on all this, it is evident that in the journey of life, the impact of a decision can be amplified by silent forces, which reveal the vulnerability of those who act without realizing the consequences of what occurs behind the scenes of the natural world. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because it is precisely at this moment of greatest vulnerability that the forces that seem invisible manifest themselves in a more concrete way. When the screams of pain and the buzzing sound of the marimbondos began to subside, one thing became clear to those watching from afar. The criminals, once confident in their quick escape strategy, were completely disoriented. The force of nature, silent and implacable, had fulfilled its role as guardian, re-establishing a kind of natural justice in that instant. They who believed they were in control saw their plans destroyed by something as simple, but at the same time as powerful, as a swarm of angry insects that came out of nowhere to defend their space. The arrival of the police officers was swift, as if a whole invisible force had sped up time to ensure that justice was done. When they heard the screams and the commotion, they already knew that something serious had happened, but what they found when they arrived at the scene was a scene of despair and defeat. The criminals, lying on the ground, some with visible injuries caused by the attacks of the marimbondos, were completely disoriented, unable to react. The surprise of seeing the police so close, with guns drawn and a firm presence, showed how effective the force of nature had been in stopping an action that seemed almost impossible to stop. The police officers acted firmly, but also with a sensitivity that revealed an understanding that often the impact of the environment and natural forces goes beyond what we can see or measure. They did not need much force to arrest those who were there, uncontrolled and frightened, lost in the midst of a chaos that they themselves created. The capture was quick, almost automatic, as if justice itself was being carried out by a greater power, which acted without haste but definitively. What seemed like a successful robbery attempt ended before it even began to truly unfold. At that moment, a sense of victory came over those who accompanied the whole scene. Justice, which often seems distant or difficult to reach, has shown its purest and most certain face. The criminals were taken into custody, their actions thwarted by a force that does not manifest itself with words or weapons, but with a natural, silent, and ruthless response. The impact of that moment reinforced the idea that the universe has its own rules, often hidden behind an apparent lull, ready to act at the right time. The force of nature, which seemed so fragile in appearance, showed its true potency by ensuring that justice was done in an unexpected but extremely effective way. The episode also left a clear lesson. Often our actions can trigger reactions that we can't predict, and what seems like a simple impulsive decision can turn into the key piece of a larger transformation. The moment of the arrest revealed that even behind the scenes of a criminal action, there are forces that work silently, in the simplest details, and that can reverse any scenario. It is as if the universe is always attentive, ready to respond to our decisions with a hidden truth that only reveals itself at the exact moment. In this case, the impact was twofold. The force of nature and the force of justice have come together to show that no matter how much we try to manipulate or run away from what surrounds us, there are limits that, when reached, turn into lessons in resistance, and that sometimes the greatest power lies in the harmony of the environment around us. In the end, the sense of achievement was reinforced by the understanding that every action has its consequences, often beyond what we can imagine. The victory of that day, marked by the rapid intervention of the police and the silent force of nature, left a deep footprint in the history of those people and in the memory of everyone who accompanied them. That night showed that transformation often comes from within, from details we ignore, from forces that remain hidden until they are triggered by a simple movement or a poorly thought-out decision. And once again, the universe has reaffirmed its role as guardian, proving that justice, when aligned with natural forces, can reverse any situation, no matter how difficult it may seem. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely at the intersection between our actions, decisions, and the invisible forces that life often presents us with its greatest lessons. The story of that robbery and the attack of the marimbondos reveals a hidden truth that we often ignore: the impact that our choices have behind the scenes of our journey. Every impulsive movement, every carelessness, no matter how simple it may seem, can trigger a chain of unpredictable and powerful events, which often escape our control until nature itself reminds us of its silent strength. This force, which remains invisible most of the time, is like a guardian that acts in the details, in the moments of distraction, in the gestures that we do not pay attention to, and that, at the right time, reveals its true essence. The transformation that occurs in these moments of impact, however painful or unexpected, carries a fundamental message. Everything in life is a matter of balance. Just as the strength of the marimbondos was able to interrupt a robbery action and put an end to the escape attempt, our actions, however minor they may seem, can trigger revelations about who we really are. Often, the hidden truth is precisely in what we fail to notice, in what we pretend not to see, or in our own arrogance to believe that we have everything under control. When we understand that the impact of our decisions reverberates behind the scenes of our mind and our environment, we come to see more clearly how much our mindset influences the course of our history. This understanding leads us to reflect on how transformation often happens from the inside out. It is not only what we do, but also what we perceive and how we position ourselves in the face of the forces that act around us. The journey of the human being is full of revelations that only come to light when we least expect it, and the impact of a decision can be the catalyst for profound change. The real strength often lies in our ability to recognize this hidden truth and learn to respect the natural rhythm of the universe. Understanding that life has its own rules, which come from a silent and often invisible place, helps us to develop a more conscious mindset, more balanced and more prepared to face whatever comes. Looking at the story of that day, it becomes clear that the impact of impulsive action can be an opportunity for learning, growth, and transformation. Every mistake, every moment of distraction carries with it a lesson that echoes in our journey. When we realize this, we also realize that true change comes not only from great actions, but from a deeper understanding of the forces at work behind the scenes in our lives. This silent force, which often goes unnoticed, is like a guardian that teaches us to have more attention, more respect, and more humility before what really matters. And by accepting this role as an apprentice, we take the first step towards a true evolution that goes far beyond what we can see on the surface. This episode, with all its intensity, reinforces the idea that life works on the details and that often the greatest impacts are hidden in seemingly insignificant actions. Nature's response was a reminder that no matter how hard we try to manipulate or plan everything, there are forces that remain behind the scenes, ready to reveal their truth at the right time. Thus, the journey of each of us becomes a series of revelations, of learnings that appear precisely in those moments when we least expect it, in the simplest details, in those small decisions that seem unimportant. When we can see this connection, we come to understand that the impact of our choices is a powerful transformation tool, capable of teaching us to respect the natural rhythm of life. And this understanding prepares us to accept the cycles of change, to evolve with more awareness, and to understand that often all we need is a little more attention to detail, the humility to recognize what is beyond our vision, and the courage to accept that deep down, life always finds a way to balance the books. If you made it this far, it's because this story really touched you in some way. Perhaps it has made you reflect on how much our actions, however minor they may seem, can trigger unexpected reactions, often in a stronger way than we can imagine. These lessons that we learn from the details of everyday life show us that being aware of what happens around us and understanding that the force of nature acts silently can make all the difference. Here at the channel, we seek precisely to bring this type of content that helps us see beyond the surface, to value the details and to understand the forces that shape our lives. If this makes sense to you, how about signing up? Thus, you stay on top of stories that, in addition to being intriguing, carry good doses of reflection. And if this message resonated in any way, leave a comment saying that I'm with you until the end, or something that shows that you followed up here. This helps create a stronger connection and also encourages those on the other side to keep bringing stories that make us think. Oh, and don't forget to leave a like, because your support makes all the difference in building a space where we can explore these themes calmly and lightly. There is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. Thus, we can continue together learning, reflecting, and discovering that often the greatest strength comes from the understanding that everything happens at a pace that only nature knows.